to be an interesting one. It's called Tordesillas, obviously reminiscing the fact that this is going to be about Brazil and Portugal and how they divided up the Western world in the Age of Exploration. Know the baseline facts, but I would love to learn more. Let's go and learn more together, kings and generals.
The Age of Exploration was one of the turning points in human history. During the early phase of this age, Portugal and Spain were the preeminent powers. The rivalry between them over the New World's wealth threatened a devastating war within Christendom at the worst possible moment. The Catholic Church would intervene to prevent this from occurring, but its decision would leave a legacy that we still live with today. Welcome to our video on how the Pope split the world between Spain and Portugal.
And it sounds like he's playing God, and it's so crazy.
Shout out to Audible for sponsoring this video. Get your first thematic video actually new to audio try Audible Generals the year 40 text Kings and Generals to 500. It is the year 1453, the year which many scholars dub as the end of the Middle Ages.
I mean, it has to be dubbed into the Middle Ages because this is when, the world really starts to open up. Now, question for all you Age of Exploration history buffs out there. When were the first colonies dubbed? Was it after 1453? Like, did Portugal or the Dutch or anyone have any colonies outside of Europe at this point? I can't remember.
Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, has finally fallen to the Ottoman Empire. With that, centuries-old patterns of travel and trade in the Mediterranean rapidly changed. One of the main changes as long-standing trade routes closed was the nosedive of Genoa's influence and power. Seeking a new livelihood, thousands of Genoese mariners, cartographers and merchants emigrated abroad. Many ended up in Portugal, and by 1481...
That's a really interesting thing because we hear all these city-states like Venice, Genoa, etc. But their rise and fall is limited to their mercantile business. That's crazy.
There were so many living in Lisbon that Portuguese King João II was advised to expel them by his councillors. However, João realized that the expertise in mercantile activity and sailing the Genoese possessed was far too valuable. Among them was a certain Christopher Columbus, who had washed ashore in the Algarve during 1476.
Wait, Columbus was by way of Genoese? Genoa?
After the merchant fleet he was sailing with was sunk. Columbus made his way to Lisbon, joining his younger brother, who had established a small map-making business. Cartography was a thriving business at the time, fueled by the economic boom that Portuguese royals had created by initiating the exploration and exploitation of West Africa's resources. Sailors from all around Europe congregated in Lisbon, trading spices, slaves, gold, wool, sugar, and other commodities.
Wow, so Lisbon becomes a melting pot because of that.
Continuing his maritime life as a merchant and sugar broker in sailing season, and concentrating on studying during winter, Columbus eventually devised a plan to sail west in order to find India. After failing to convince João II, who was increasingly concentrating on a southern route around the newly named Cape of Good Hope, Columbus went to Spain. There, he eventually secured the patronage of the so-called Catholic Majesties, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, who had recently conquered the Moorish kingdom at Granada. The fact that Portugal had recently succeeded in establishing a route into the Indian Ocean possibly motivated Spanish desire for a route to the exotic, profitable spice lands which was not dominated by their European rival.
Goa. Interesting.
If such a venture to the west failed, only relatively minor funds would be wasted, but if it succeeded, the Spanish would be wealthy beyond imagining. Was that not a risk worth taking? On September 6, 1492, Columbus set off on his journey from the Canary Islands with his crew.
I'm sorry. You should have said he sailed the ocean blue. You should have said that, kings and generals.
Crew and 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, on a voyage that would change the world forever. After a months-long journey involving many trials and tribulations, land was finally spotted on October 12th. This first landmass was probably one of the Bahamas and was named San Salvador by Columbus. After meeting the locals and viewing many exotic things, Columbus began exploring further. October 28th saw the flotilla reach the island of Cuba, and on January 18th it set off for home after trade with the natives and searches for gold.
And just think about it. It's like, don't take this the wrong way, but it's like you're discovering a different species, because different culture, different, they look different, they sound different, they don't understand some of the things that you guys are doing, different religions, different everything. So you can start to see like why there was so much supremacy along the colonialists as they entered places like Central America, etc. Such a wild time in history we're witnessing.
After
right
a
here.
perilous return voyage, during which his ship was racked by storms, and after being imprisoned by the Portuguese on the Azores, Columbus's battered ship docked at Lisbon for repairs.
Why were they imprisoned?
He was apparently unable to get to Spain right away. However, it is also speculated that Columbus purposely came to Lisbon in order to brag of his successful voyage to King João II.
Ha!
Given the Portuguese monarch's reputation for brutality, it seems like a bad idea on Columbus's part. Nevertheless, upon docking at Lisbon aside a giant Portuguese warship, Columbus sent word to João of his arrival from the Indies and entertained the locals with exotic prisoners and the
With exotic prisoners? That's crazy.
novelty this represented. In short order, news of the voyage would spread throughout Europe. While his ship was being repaired, Columbus was summoned by the king and so set off inland. Upon his arrival at the court, he and the king supposedly talked freely, despite João's agitation at Columbus's arrogance and his loss of the opportunity. However, he also informed Columbus that, regretfully, whilst he was greatly pleased with the success of the voyage, the new discoveries belonged to him and not the Spanish monarchs.
You and what army?
Because of earlier treaties and papal donations. This was the first indication of conflict between the two states over the New World. When the explorer eventually managed to get back to Spain, he was treated like a hero and received graciously by the monarchs. As Columbus was telling his riveting tale to the royal court, João II publicly announced that the newly discovered lands belonged to Portugal, and even ordered a mighty armada to shadow Columbus on his next voyage to occupy this new land for the Portuguese crown.
Dang.
In return, the Catholic majesties of Spain maneuvered their fleets closer to Portugal, preparing for conflict.
I'm mad. This is crazy because we could have seen like a land conflict between Portugal and Spain because of this, right?
Realizing Portugal's naval might was superior, Ferdinand and Isabella sent the matter to be decided by the one person whose authority was beyond question, the Pope in Rome. At this point in history, the Pope was a man with the pontifical name of Alexander VI, but he is better known as a certain Rodrigo Borgia. Borgia
The Borgias.
was a very capable man who had served as the vice-chancellor for the previous Pope, and whose political ambition was of the highest order. Under the weak leadership and subsequent death of Innocent VIII from 1484 to 1492, a period of chaos had stricken Rome, and it was clear that a pope strong enough to restore order was needed. So, on August 11, 1492, Borgia took the papal throne. Upon receiving the envoys from
He took, or was he elected?
Ferdinand and Isabella, whom Borgia had always viewed favourably, in April 1493, the Pope began taking into account the precedents set in rulings from previous decades and issued the first of 3 edicts. Its name was the Inter Caetera. This edict was known as a papal bull, named after the bulla seal used to authenticate a public decree made by the Pope, and was usually reserved for important topics. These edicts were the sole basis for any European claim on the New World discovered by the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, and provided a justification for the conquest of the Americas for centuries to come. Moreover, they were the wedge that drove European nations into centuries of intermittent warfare over colonial wealth and prestige. The first Inter Caetera, dated May 3, 1493, granted Spain the exclusive right to travel in, trade with, or colonize the discovered lands, provided they were not already the possession of a Christian ruler.
It had, obviously you can see the supremacy there, but it's an interesting one. So now that first edict just allows them to freely do as they wish, as long as like Portugal doesn't already have claims on them or some other Christian kingdom.
However, the wording of this bull was quite vague, much to the dissatisfaction of the Catholic majesties. So they again sent ambassadors to the Pope. Instead of begging the Pope for a favor, the Spanish ambassadors chastised Borgia's lack of support for his native land, as he was by birth a native of Aragon.
Oh.
It was suggested that Ferdinand might hesitate in the future to offer military aid to the papacy. This was crucial, as the French king Charles VIII claimed sovereignty over Naples and would have to march through Rome to get there. These political pressures led to 2 new papal bulls, which were more favourable to the Catholic monarchs. The second edict, known as Eximiae Devotionis, clarified and rephrased the first bull. It placed emphasis on the rights granted to Portugal in Africa, Guinea, and the gold mine and elsewhere in previous decades, whilst granting Spain those same rights over the lands to the west which had been discovered by Columbus. Concluding the trio was the second Inter Caetera. The vague language of the first was replaced by a precise line of demarcation in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, drawn arbitrarily on a north-south boundary
Arbitrarily, not knowing where that's going.
around 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde. All lands to the east of the demarcation line would belong to Portugal, while all lands to the west would be under Spanish dominion. No other ships were legally allowed to sail in these waters without the consent of these empires.
Dang. It's kind of harsh. And it's really hard. You can't just, when you have a sphere, one line does not actually divide it. You have to have 2 lines. So we'll see what they do there.
As the word of the bull spread, the resounding implications of Borgia's act became clearer to all. Columbus was quickly arranging his second voyage, while João II was furious at being diplomatically outmaneuvered. However, just as Spain's monopoly over the vast regions west of the demarcation line had been secured by papal decree, so too had the Pope secured Portuguese monopoly over Africa and most of Asia.
Yeah, and wasn't that the whole point, Columbus?
So, João did not send his fleet to the west, fearing it would undermine his own gains. The Pope was probably rushed by the necessity of averting a potentially devastating war between Christendom's most powerful nations. Nevertheless, João II immediately objected, not satisfied with any decision that might hinder Portuguese maritime opportunities at the very moment his naval strength was at its height. Still, João did not care to launch any fleet into the Spanish-appointed territories, fearing papal wrath and excommunication. Spain held almost all the cards in negotiations. So, João took stock of the situation and settled down to negotiate, hoping to salvage what he could from the situation. In March of 1494, a delegation of Portuguese officials visited Spain and, after months of debate, eventually reached a historic agreement on June 7th, the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Ah, so the Pope really wasn't involved in that. The Pope really set up the precedent unless he's the arbiter of this.
It was mostly just a reaffirmation of the papal bull's conditions, but had a few additions. One of these was the planned
The calligraphy is just beautiful, by the way.
joint Spanish-Portuguese expedition to the Cape Verde Islands and beyond, during which boundary towers would be established. However, this ambitious endeavour was put on hold. The most significant deviation from Borgia's papal edicts was in the placement of the demarcation line. While the Portuguese king acknowledged Spain's legal rights in the territories of the west, he argued that because his ships constantly navigated these waters, the boundary was simply too narrow. These claims were acceptable to the Spanish, and both sides eventually agreed that the new line would run north to south 370 leagues, or around 1,200 miles, west of Cape Verde instead of 100 leagues.
And now this is where you get some Brazilian property.
Many historians believe that the Portuguese monarch was actually aware of the lands in Brazil before the treaty, and that
I wouldn't put it past them, especially how many times they've gone through this area.
his insistence in moving the line was to protect his rights to that land. However, the official discovery of Brazil actually came 6 years after the
official, but they could have easily been scouting it.
treaty. After a subsequent
What do you guys think?
series of voyages increased tensions even more, the Treaty of Tordesillas was confirmed by papal bull Air Quay in 1506, giving sanction to its terms and the line of demarcation. In the decade that followed, Spain only profited slightly from the Tordesillas Treaty that it had so fervently pushed the Pope to support. Meanwhile, the apparent loser, Portugal, was still growing rich and powerful as Europe's spice supplier, due to the fact that it had consolidated its eastern gains in India and Indonesia.
So in the short term, well, we'll talk about it a little bit.
Not to be outdone, Spain tried again, led by another explorer, Ferdinand Magellan. He was an experienced sailor and soldier, having already embarked on numerous expeditions into Africa and India by 1517, and knew about Portugal's plans and operations. These deeds aside, he was hated by the new king Manuel I, who had succeeded Duo II in 1495. After Magellan's request to lead a fleet to the Indies was refused, and he was publicly humiliated by Manuel, the 37-year-old left Portugal.
It seems like it's like a direct parallel to Columbus.
Continuing the Columbus-inspired tradition of being rejected by Portugal and embraced by the Spanish, Magellan quickly appeared at the court of Charles I, and the future Holy Roman Emperor welcomed Magellan to his service. After presenting a plan to find a route to the Spice Islands through Spain's half of the world, Magellan had much better luck than Columbus. Charles I realized that any success in such a bold maritime venture would check Portugal's success, increase his own wealth, and consolidate his rule. So, by spring of 1519, Magellan had signed an agreement with the Spanish monarch, almost definitely to the great irritation of Portugal. After numerous attempts by Manuel to convince or coerce Magellan into returning failed, the commander set forth from the Guadalquivir River's mouth on September 20th, 1519, with 5 ships. The details of this famous expedition are best left for a future video of their own. But
it was really good. It was a really good expedition, and for him to go below South America and then end up, it's amazing.
Despite Magellan's own death in the Philippines during mid-1521, the remnant of his voyage managed to return to Spain. This was the first circumnavigation of the globe. Naturally, the mariners had to pass through Portugal's half of the world to get home.
And Magellan's credited, but he actually never made it back. He never circumnavigated. I know it's like, but we got to respect him, but he actually never circumnavigated. He died in the Philippines. Some people did, though.
And they had also taken spices from the Moluccas Islands, which the new king of Portugal, Duo III, declared were his by right. Determined to avoid war yet again, the monarchs of Spain and Portugal agreed to hold a conference at which the greatest cosmologists, navigators, cartographers, and other educated people would discuss the division of the world, since its dimensions were now more well known. Still, 2 more fleets were launched to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, by Spain, and they even fought a few small-scale battles with Portuguese ships. Events over at the other side of the world, in the lands Columbus had discovered, now proved to be most important. Any expedition to the Spice Islands proved so costly as to consume any possible profit, but Hernan Cortez's expedition to modern Mexico began to open up the true wealth of the Americas to Spain. Now the Spice Islands were secondary, and Charles would concede them. The 1529 Treaty of Zaragoza settled the issue once and for all, at least between Spain and Portugal. Both empires agreed that the line of demarcation on the far side of the world would fall to the east of the Spice Islands, in effect giving them to Portugal.
Philippines are inside that. I thought the Philippines fell to Spain.
In return, Duo III, who was becoming increasingly wealthy from spice trade profits and lacking any costly military engagements in European politics, gave Charles I 350,000 gold ducats. Of course, this treasure haul was subsequently used to wage war against France. This historic agreement ended the first great battle over control of the world's most valuable commodities and refined the boundaries established in 1493. Though it lessened the dangerous maritime rivalry between Spain and Portugal, empires do not reign supreme forever. Soon, rising powers such as England, the Dutch Republic, and France would begin to challenge Iberian hegemony over the New World. In the 1520s, however, Spain was just beginning its ascent to its status as the world's premier state of the 16th century.
Yeah.
The quantity of gold leaving the Americas for Spain gradually increased through the 1500s, from 52,700 pesos worth with Cortez's first expedition to a massive 800,000 in 1570. With the discovery of this seemingly limitless wealth, the age of colonization began. We always have more.
Love this video to explain everything. Amazing. Yeah, like in the short term, Portugal won, but in the long term, Spain definitely won. Obviously, Africa and the Indies were more or less short term goals, and that treaty, and they even got Brazil, so Portugal felt really, really good. Really good. But then Spain just kind of just built off that momentum from the Americas, and of course, as we know, most of South America comes under Spanish rule. Central America under Spanish rule. Parts of North America Spanish rule. The Caribbean Spanish rule. Until subsequent French, English, and Dutch colonies kind of like divided up a little bit more. Interesting stuff, guys. I love doing Kings and Journal videos because they're just so informative. Appreciate you guys as always. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.